Welcome to the Plain Talk Podcast. I'm Rob Port. Later in the program, we're going to talk with State Representative Scott Lauser. He's got legislation that would, in talking with him, I didn't even realize this when I first looked at the bill, but in talking to him, I learned he would actually mandate that local candidates affiliate themselves with a political party. Now, they could affiliate themselves as an independent. They wouldn't have to go and join a political party. You could still just be an independent, but you would have to declare one thing or another. Another interesting thing about it that I learned, you wouldn't actually have to, get a party's nomination. You wouldn't have to win a Republican primary or get the nomination at a Republican convention or a Democratic convention or what have you in order to affiliate yourself with that political party. Anyway, interesting policy proposal. We'll talk about it a little bit later in the program. But before we get there, I had a few things I wanted to weigh in on that are happening right now. First and foremost, the North Dakota Petroleum Council has issued a study, a report, along with the Western Dakota Energy Association. And what they did is they looked back at the last decade of taxes that the oil industry has paid. And I got to tell you, the numbers, even for somebody like me who follows this stuff closely, are surprising. Going back 10 years, the oil industry, and this is an important point for something for a reason I'll point out in just a moment. The oil industry has paid nearly $18 billion in just extraction and production taxes. Those are just the direct taxes on the oil industry. Has paid almost $18 billion over the last 10 years. That's 44% of all of the taxes collected by the state of North Dakota, right? So counting up every sort of tax that the government collects, income tax, sales tax, all of it, the oil industry represents 44% of that. Over the last 5 fiscal years, the production and extraction tax represent 50% of all taxes collected by the state of North Dakota. That's amazing. That's remarkable. And the reason why it's important to realize that we're just talking about those two direct taxes on the oil industry is because we're not counting the millions and millions and millions of dollars in revenue that oil activity generates through the sales tax or through the income tax, right? When we hire all these new workers and we're paying them, 6-figure salaries and all the rest of it, and that drives up income tax revenues, and all those workers, they're out and they're buying things. The industry itself, all the companies that are coming here and they're exploring and they're buying things, for their oil rigs or whatever, that drives sales taxes. So even just setting aside all of that stuff, just looking at the two direct taxes alone, 50% of all taxes collected by the state of North Dakota. Ladies and gentlemen, that is a remarkable figure. And I think it tells us two things. First of all, when I hear it, I'm both very happy because I support energy development in the state of North Dakota. I think it's a great thing. I think the oil industry being here it's been wonderful for our state. It's not perfect. Nothing is. But they hire a lot of people. They produce a lot of jobs. It's been a boon for Western North Dakota. It's a good thing. So I'm glad it's happening. And when I see that figure, to me, what that means is we have a thriving industry in our state right now. Where it gives me some trepidation, however, is the fact that we are talking about one industry over the last 5 fiscal years providing half of the taxes. I look at that and I see the potential for a too many eggs in one basket scenario. Now, there's a couple of ways the North Dakota Petroleum Council said that they released this in order to inform lawmakers who are, debating policy issues down in Bismarck and to inform the public. And I think that's important because I don't think the public realizes that the oil industry is paying half of the taxes in the state of North Dakota. I don't think they realize that. And when we hear on a previous episode, I interviewed State Senator Merrill Pepcorn, and when we hear somebody like that, he's talking about how we're not taxing the oil industry enough. Well, they're paying half of the taxes, so how could we not be taxing them enough? That's one issue. The other issue is you have a lot of people in the public who feel the same way, that we're not taxing the oil industry enough, that the oil industry is getting away with something. Again, if they're paying half of the taxes in the state, what are they getting away with? So I think it informs that debate. The other part of the debate it informs is, efforts to narrow our tax base. So, there's a lot of people out there who want to say eliminate the income tax. There's a lot of people out there, who want to do other things with taxes because we've got all these oil revenues coming in. So why pay so much in income taxes? Why pay all these other taxes? That's a dangerous thing because the oil industry is not predictable. Again, they're paying 50% of the taxes, but as we saw over the last couple of budget cycles, what happens when oil prices drop? Thankfully, we started to see a recovery, and thankfully things are recovered now. But we don't know what the markets are going to do. We don't know what the future holds for the oil industry, and half of our state tax revenues are coming from oil, which would argue for maybe not narrowing our tax base to just the oil industry, and would also argue, in fact, about diversifying our economy so we get some other industries here, some other sorts of jobs, some other sorts of commerce and economic activity to generate revenues so that oil is a smaller piece of the pie. I don't want oil to be a smaller piece of the pie because we're doing less oil in our state. I don't want that to happen. I want the industry to thrive, but I would like oil to be a smaller piece of the pie because the pie is bigger. Those are a couple of things when I read that report. The full thing's at sayanythingblog.com, the full report, some of my commentary on it, if you want to check it out there. I think that would be worth your time. Another thing that I want to talk about, state lawmakers. I've been talking a lot about Measure 1 here on the podcast. I've been talking a lot about it at sayanythingblog.com, and I don't like the measure. As a matter of fact, the measure is unconstitutional. As a matter of fact, this is what the ACLU said about Measure 1 during the 2018 election cycle. They said, I quote, Measure 1 is actually so poorly written that it would institute a host of new restrictions and regulations on political speech and advocacy that would violate the First Amendment rights of all citizens. Violate the First Amendment rights of all citizens. So what's going on now? We've seen a lot of Sturm and Drang. We've had the Fargo Forum editorial come in and lash out at lawmakers for not being willing to, to vigorously implement Measure 1. A lot of the measure supporters have been making that argument as well. But here's the thing. A lot of people feel that Measure 1 is unconstitutional. A lot of people think that Measure 1 has deep, deep problems. So there's a House concurrent resolution. And what this House concurrent resolution is, it's a piece of legislation that would order a study conducted by legislative management, and it would look into things like whether legislative action is necessary or desirable, right? So whether Measure 1 is necessary or desirable. And I think that's a good thing. I don't think the legislature should rush to implement Measure 1. I think that would be a mistake. I think Measure 1 has deep flaws, and we shouldn't embrace it. We shouldn't rush to enshrine that in our state statutes simply because it was passed by the people. Now, I know there's a lot of people out there who think, it's the initiated measure process. The will of the people are infallible. The people are wonderful. The people approved it. Therefore, it's all sacrosanct, and the legislature ought not touch it. But here's the thing. If it's bad policy, if it's unconstitutional policy, if you really feel that way, then the legislature is performing its function by resisting implementing it. Now, I don't want to speak for the bill's sponsor. It's Speaker of the House, Lawrence Clamine. He's a state representative, Republican from Bismarck. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but if his intent here is to create some room so that the courts could perhaps weigh in on Measure 1, then I think that's to the good. Or if it creates some room for some further study for Measure 1. Because let's face it, one thing that the initiated measure process does not provide is it does not provide us with a good venue for debating the nuances for meaty policy, lengthy policy like Measure 1 before we go sticking it into our state constitution. It's one of the flaws with the initiated measure process. So if the legislature is going to go out and study this, I think that's a good thing. I got a post about that up at sayanythingblog.com as well if you want to check that. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about, and this is perhaps the most interesting, it's House Bill 1509. It was introduced by State Representative Carla Hansen. She's a Democrat from Fargo. And what it would do is it would create a mandatory family medical leave program to be administered by Workforce Safety and Insurance, our state's workers' compensation agency. And essentially what it would be, first of all, it would tax wages, right? So it would be a tax on wages. So it would be something along the lines of, I believe it's 2 cents for every $10 of wages. Now, by my math, an employee earning $50,000 per year would represent about a $100 tax paid to this fund. So the money would go into the fund. The fund would then be used to pay employees for leave time that could qualify. They could qualify for up to 3 months. It's 12 weeks, so roughly 3 months of leave time to care for a family member. and it would mandate it. If you're an employer with over 50 or more employees, you would be mandated to participate in this program. If you had less than 50 employees, participation would be optional. But essentially, the big employers, they would have to pay this tax. They would have to collect this tax and pay it. And let's face it, the employees ultimately pay this. Anytime we put a new mandate on employers, they pass that along either in the form of higher prices for their goods and services, or they pass it along for their employees as, counting it as their part of their total compensation, which of course suppresses wages. So you've got that problem. But the other thing is this is a mandate for the business community, to provide this, or I guess not even provide it. The mandate is for the employment, the employers to collect the tax. It's really the government providing the program. I mean, we're creating essentially kind of a new entitlement for family leave for up to 12 weeks. Now, I'm not against family leave. I'm not against the concept of it. I am against creating government programs like this. I think a lot of employers in this country are already implementing family leave programs. And they're doing it at a rate in a way that's flexible. So, each business can kind of, craft it and have it be unique to the special circumstances of their employees. I think that's a good thing. Now, are there some bad employers out there who don't want to do this sort of thing, who resist it, who aren't interested in fostering a healthy relationship with their employees? Sure. There's bad actors in any group of people. But I don't think the government should step in with a mandate like this. I think we ought to leave this up to the never-ending negotiations between employees and employers, right? I mean, because we're seeing it all the time where employers are doing more and more. They're getting creative with their benefits and their pay structure and everything else as a way to attract new employees. And employees, as they move up the ladder, can command those sorts of changes, can command that employers, cater to them in that way. And it's not a perfect process, but I still prefer it over the government mandating it, because the government mandating it is a little bit scary. Anyway, the bill is HB 1509 if you want to check that out. That's it. We're going to move on to our interview with State Representative Scott Lauser right now. State Representative Scott Lauser joins me. He's a Republican from Minot. I should get that out of the way first, since what we're going to be discussing is legislation about partisan affiliation. Now, currently in North Dakota, local offices are nonpartisan, which means that when you're voting for county commission, when you're voting for city commission, city council, depending on where you're at, the candidates on the ballot don't have a partisan affiliation. It doesn't say Republican. It doesn't say Democrat. It doesn't say Libertarian. It doesn't say anything. Representative Lauser's bill would change that. It wouldn't require a party affiliation, but it would allow candidates, if they want to identify themselves as a Republican, as a Democrat, what have you, it would allow for that. The bill is HB 1375, and I've got Representative Lauser with me from the Capitol. Scott, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Rob?
Pretty good. So tell me, what's the impetus behind this bill? What made you want to put this in?
Well, I think, every election we go to the ballot box and probably wonder oftentimes you know who you're voting for, but what's their political philosophy? And currently in North Dakota, we have a prohibition on local candidates declaring a party, which to me seems absurd. I don't know the history behind it, but the fact is our local candidates are precluded from identifying with a party as they run for office. And we often hear that all politics is local. We're in this midst of transparency in North Dakota politics right now. And it seems to make really good sense that the people that are closest to the elected officials that are closest to the voters should have that same transparency and let the voters know what party they identify with.
So essentially, you're making a transparency argument for this. You're saying, listen, it'll be more transparent if these candidates are able to identify themselves as affiliated with a certain party, and that just makes it more clear on voters, because that's what we really care about, right? I mean, that's what we're all voting on. I know that being partisan is something of a dirty word these days, but I think we also need to acknowledge it has its utility as well. If you say you're a Republican, that indicates some degree of adherence to a set of ideas that the Republican Party stands for. Now, we could talk about, how sincere, Republicans or Democrats are about their party's platforms or whatever, but I think there is some value in that partisan affiliation. And what you're saying is you want to bring that value to local elections.
Absolutely. And when you talk about local elections, this would also include school board and park board. And I guess the other thought that I have that I'll testify in the committee about in the coming weeks is these elected officials have the ability to levy taxes or levy mills that result in property taxes on your property. And I would like to have at least a philosophy or some sort of way to identify who is running for office with the ability to tax the property.
Now, I think there's value in that. Now, let's make sure we're clear about all the offices. We're talking county elections, city elections. You mentioned park boards, school boards. What about sheriffs? I mean, is that part of this or is that separate?
No, that's going to be included. The language would include sheriffs and state's attorneys.
Okay.
I would imagine people are going to say, yeah, but, and they're going to want some carve outs. I've heard some really good arguments, some states' rights type arguments with federal gun legislation and enforcement of potential federal law, where people say, I want to know who I'm voting for and what their party affiliation with regard to every office that we just talked about for different reasons.
Now, have you spoken to anything, the political parties themselves? Because obviously the parties have a process for deciding, which candidates they want to represent them on the ballot. We have district conventions for local races. We have the state convention for the statewide races. Of course, a lot of it's ultimately settled on the June primary. I mean, have you spoken to? You're a Republican. Have you spoken to the Republican Party about this? Have you spoken to Democrats, Libertarians? Do the parties want this?
I have reached out to the Republican Party, obviously, being a member of the Republican Party, and I believe they're going to testify neutral. They see benefit in it. They want to keep those elections local, of course. The legislative districts, you could have a city or a county or a school board cross over legislative districts. So we're not talking about the organization at the legislative district level. This is simply party affiliation. My guess, and I'm not going to speak for any of the two major parties or any party for that matter, my guess is there's a benefit to the parties, regardless of which party it is, when they can identify at an early stage people that might want to be active within their party and maybe run for office at the state level or higher. This is a way for the state parties to identify who those people are.
You mentioned before we began the interview, I wrote about your bill earlier this month, and once again, it's HB 1375 if people want to look that up, or you could certainly find my post at sayanythingblog.com. I wrote about it, but before we started, you had mentioned that there's possibly going to be amendment for the bill. Is that something you can talk about at this point?
Sure. There is a prohibition at the federal level for federal employees to declare a party or be partisan in their capacity, and so we're going to have an amendment that's going to address if there's a restriction for anybody that is currently a federal employee from having to declare a party. Now, the bill as drafted also says or independent, so it doesn't say Republican, Democrat, or other party. It says any party or independent, and I verified with counsel that independent is a status, not a party. And so the amendment that we're going to have would remove the requirement for any federal employee that's running for office from having to declare a party based on the Hatch Act.
Okay, so essentially, if you're a federal, so what would happen then if you're working for the federal government in some capacity and you wanted to run for your local school board, you would just say you're an independent?
Well, the way the amendment is going to read currently, the amendment says that you would be not required to declare a party. The option of being independent still exists. I would like the committee to debate that because this just came up, actually just came up yesterday, and so I got the amendment last night. The bill has yet to be presented to committee, so we're going to have to address, what the committee determines is best language.
Well, do you think there'd be a problem if you're requiring, like, if I don't work for the federal government and now, I have to declare as either an independent or somebody in the party, but then the federal government people don't. I mean, is that going to create like a problem, like unequal treatment in the election law?
Well, I think probably the solution to that is that the identifier on the ballot would show maybe parentheses small I referencing independent, which again is not a party, it's a status. And
Yeah.
so the solution is probably going to be in that scenario that those people claim to be independent.
I feel like your goal here is just to make the whole thing optional, right? I mean, you don't necessarily have to identify as a Republican or Democrat if you don't want to. I think that's what you're trying to get to. It's just that if you are a Republican and you want to tell people that you're a Republican, you can, and you can do so on the ballot, and you can identify that way, and voters can make up their minds how they feel about that.
Well, this bill would require the identification, so it is a two-step process. The first thing is it removes the prohibition, and secondly, it places a requirement. So it does take it to that level of requiring a declaration in your candidacy. So this isn't optional, and that is where I think there's going to be some pushback. If we had perfect bills, there wouldn't be a need for us to even be here. So I'm looking forward to the debate. I've got a number of examples and responses, I think, to those that may say this is a bad idea for a given circumstance. I'm really looking forward to the discussion and hearing why this is not a good idea.
Well, let's run through some of those arguments, because like I said, I posted about this earlier this month, and I saw some of the pushback on it. And one thing that a lot of people are saying is, politics is already too partisan. Local politics are more pure. Why muddy up local politics with by injecting partisan politics into it? What do you say to people who are making that argument?
Well, they're making the argument that local politics is politics. How are we ever going to take politics out of local politics? That I don't buy that argument at all. Just having a party affiliation is not going to make local politics more or less political.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. What about other people who are saying, why we already nominate so many candidates? We're already doing all this. We got to nominate candidates for public service commissioner and insurance commissioner and governor and Congress and all this other stuff. What about people who just say, listen, at the local level, just enough of that baloney. Let's just have it. Let's just do things the way we're doing them.
Well, we are doing things the way we're doing them. This is not requiring a nomination process unless a local, the city or the county or the school board wants to initiate their own nominating process. This is not changing. This isn't requiring a nomination. This is declaring a party on the ballot. So it wouldn't add a layer in nomination. It wouldn't change the voting process. So let's say, for instance, there are 3 positions available in the school board, and there's six candidates running. 5 of them could be Democrats and 1 could be a Republican, and all 3 elected could be Democrats. There is no change in how we're going to vote. This is simply making the declaration on the ballot.
Well, if there's no nominating process, what would stop somebody from facetiously claiming to be a member of a political party that they're really not? Like, I don't know, maybe former Senator Heidi Heitkamp runs for the Fargo City Commission, and she runs as a Republican. Now, obviously, given how recognizable former Senator Heitkamp is, people would see through that. But if there's no nominating process, are you putting the political parties in the role of being affiliated with candidates they didn't vet and they didn't nominate?
That would potentially be the case, where the political parties say, we didn't nominate that person, and I think that's probably why they're going to, I expect they're going to testify neutral. But that can already happen. Somebody can claim, and we hear it. In fact, I see it on your blog once in a while. Somebody says, "Hey, they're a Democrat, but they put the R on the ballot to get elected." That's happening now, or at least the perception of that's happening now. So I don't see how doing it at the local level is going to make the process less pure or more pure. It's just a disclosure to the voters to say, I'm identifying myself with a party. It doesn't have to be Democrat or Republican, by the way. It could be Green or Libertarian. Actually, interesting, if you go do a search on the Legislative Council the Legislative Council website where you can search for your legislator. You can pick the chamber and filter by party. And there's a number of parties that the Legislative Council website recognizes that nobody in our chamber serves under. For instance, the Green Party or the Constitution Party. There's nothing stopping from anybody from claiming to be a member of a party. In this case, it's just identifying. It's not suggesting they received the nomination.
That's interesting. Last question, and I started off, asking you what brought you to want to do this, and maybe this is a little bit of a variation on that, but a lot of people I'm hearing are saying, "What's broken?" Right? The status quo is just fine. What are we trying to fix?
Well, I'm not going to suggest that it's completely broken, but the people that I've talked to that support this really like the idea because they want to know that the candidates that are running for office are able to say, this is the party that I identify with and the political philosophy that I stand behind. Right now, as I mentioned, local candidates are prohibited from doing that. I will give an example in my own district, in District 5 in Minot, when I first ran for office, and this is something I'll bring up in testimony in the hearing. Our current Senator, Randy Burkhardt, left the Minot City Council, what we'll call a nonpartisan position on the Minot City Council, and ran as a Republican to run for the Senate in District 5. The person that he was running to replace was a Democrat, Tom Seymour, from District 5, who was retiring out of the Senate and, ironically enough, ended up running for City Council as a nonpartisan position. So you had a nonpartisan position leaving City Council and running for the Senate as a Republican in District 5, and the replacement was a retiring Democrat from District 5 running as a nonpartisan position on the City Council, taking Burkhardt's seat. How do you go from saying I'm a political person, but I can't tell you that's the case? I think this is just a higher level of disclosure, transparency, and I am convinced it's the better of the two options for the voters.
I think what you just described there, I think, illustrates the absurdity of the current prohibition, where you're not allowed to say, listen, I'm a Republican, even though, like in what you just, or I'm a Democrat, as the case may be, even though in the scenario that you just laid out, it's blindingly obvious. So I understand getting rid of the prohibition. I may need to think a little bit more about people being able to just say I'm a Republican without some sort of a process that allows the Republican Party to have a say in people who, carry that label, whether it's Republican or Democrat or Libertarian, what have you, give the parties a say in, who they're associated with. I got to think a little bit more about that, but it's an interesting debate. I'm glad you brought it forward. Thanks for your time, Scott.
Absolutely. Thanks for the call, Rob.
That's it for today's Plain Talk podcast. Just a reminder, I'm going to be out this Friday, so no episode tomorrow, but I'll be back at it Monday morning, so stay tuned for that. If you want to subscribe to the podcast, you can, of course, go to sayanythingblog.com, click on the Plain Talk podcast at the top. All of the links you need to subscribe are there, the RSS link, the iTunes link, the Google Play link, Spotify link. It's all there. Subscribe. And thank you for listening so far. If you have any problems, email me, rob@sayanythingblog.com. Some of you have been emailing me. A couple of you had some troubles. A couple of you who are new to podcasting had some issues. Was happy to help out. Also, some people just had some feedback on the show. Of course, always welcome that as well. Email me, rob@sayanythingblog.com. You can find me on Twitter @RobPort. Track me down on Facebook. I'm under Rob Port there as well. Say Anything Blog is on Facebook and Twitter as well. Check that out. And thanks for listening. We'll talk again.